Before the release of Mega Dimension, I had a lot of theories about what this DLC was going to be about, and as it turned out, basically none of them were correct. But there was also one big question that I was hoping would be addressed about ZA. Something huge from the base games that was never explained or justified. Something with massive implications. The very large elephant in the room, so to speak. And in this video, which I've decided is best presented in the form of a slideshow, I want to question what exactly a Legends game is, or more accurately, what connects Legends Arceus to Legends ZA. When ZA was first revealed, it was naturally assumed that it would also be set in the past, since that was one of the most notable things about Legends Arceus. And with the reveal teasing something about a Lumiose redevelopment plan, the initial thought was that ZA was going to be set during the initial construction of modern-day Lumiose. Legends Arceus is thought to be based around the time of the Meiji Restoration, which took place around the year 1870, and the Eiffel Tower in France was built just before 1890, so this new Legends game could reasonably be set a few years after Legends Arceus, and focus on the construction of Prism Tower. Being set around the same time period would also allow for the possibility of returning characters like Professor Laventon, or even a continuation of the plot if Volo is still trying to dethrone God. But instead, ZA is set 5 years after the events of X and Y. Or at least a hybrid version of their plots that involves both Xerneas and Yveltal, and we can infer that the plots of other games have already happened by this point too. Since Leon is no longer the Galar champion, that puts ZA after Sword and Shield, and since the Beast Ball is also obtainable in both of these games, that must mean they come after Sun and Moon. As far as I can tell, there aren't any direct references to the events of Scarlet and Violet, which we know is set after Sword and Shield, since the book that Sonia was writing can be read in the school's library, and references the destruction of the Stone One Side mural. But even if ZA takes place before Scarlet and Violet, it's still a far cry from the era of Legends Arceus. The story of both Legends games are also entirely unrelated, so this isn't a sequel or anything like that. The only acknowledgement of the previous game is the Hisui exhibit in the museum, which does provide some small pieces of information about what happened after the story ended. For example, Ingo somehow made his way back to the present day, and Volo is seemingly confirmed to be either immortal or a time traveller. His outfit can be seen on display, and one of the visitors casually mentions that the owner donated it himself and came to visit the exhibition. But this has nothing to do with the plot of ZA, and visiting the museum isn't even a required part of the story until the DLC. So if the setting and the story aren't connected, it seems like the only real definition of a Legends game lies in the mechanics. While not entirely similar, both Arceus and ZA have a battle system that is distinct from the main series, with Arceus having strong and agile moves that impact the turn order, and ZA abolishing the turn-based aspect entirely. Both games also have a more free-form approach to catching, allowing you to pelt balls at wild Pokemon directly, as well as featuring boss battles that require physically avoiding attacks yourself, instead of just battling using your Pokemon. But these are all just game mechanics. They only make sense in the context that we are playing a video game, and these are the rules by which we are allowed to interact. They aren't really observable diegetic elements of the world itself. For example, these are the only main games where you can be hurt directly by wild Pokemon, but there's no reason to believe that only ever happens in Lumiose and Hisui. That's just because other games don't allow for that to happen outside of story events. So maybe Legends is just the name that they're giving to this specific type of Pokemon game, like Rumble or Ranger, but that doesn't feel like a satisfying answer. The title of Legends has gravitas. It implies that there is a legend to be told, not this is a game where you can do combat rolls. So what is the one undeniable feature that exists only in Legends Arceus and Legends ZA, which is also directly acknowledged as a real canon phenomenon and not an abstracted game mechanic? Something that's big and in your face this whole time. Something huge that, yeah, I'm not doing this bit again. It's the alphas. The inclusion of alpha Pokemon in ZA has been bugging me since before the game even came out. I mean, it's cool that they're back, and I have enjoyed shiny hunting for them, but seriously, why are they here? And even now, after finishing the entire game, the DLC, the post-game, and every single side quest, I'm still no closer to finding a solid answer. The very first side quest in the game, and one of the only mandatory ones, involves helping someone with an Alpha Bunnelby encounter, which is required before Alpha Pokemon start appearing in the wild. I assumed that we would be getting more side quests to explore why Alpha Pokemon were appearing in Lumiose City, but after this point, the presence of Alphas is barely addressed again by the story. Some side missions involve dealing with Alpha Pokemon, and you do get unique responses by using Alphas to fulfill certain requests for NPCs, so at least we can safely say that they do canonically exist. An Alpha Fungus, it's surprisingly a Mooncat! God damn it. I really set her up for that one, didn't I? But there is never any attempt to justify or question what they're doing in present-day Lumiose. Nobody questioned the Alphas in Legends Arceus because the entire setting of Hisui already justified their presence. Hisui was presented to us as an untamed wilderness, and while it was once inhabited by the Celestica people, now all that remains are 2 small indigenous clans, with the rest of Hisui having been reclaimed by nature and untouched by modern civilization. As a result, the Pokemon in this region are the wildest they've ever been, and Alpha Pokemon felt like a logical representation of that. Under that assumption, it also makes sense that Alphas haven't appeared in any other region, because every other game is set in the modern era where Pokemon have become used to the presence of people. Even if wild Pokemon aren't fully domesticated, even the most remote parts of a region usually have a few trainers hanging around. But this interpretation makes their return in ZA all the more confusing, because while Hisui showed us the furthest separation between humans and Pokemon, Lumiose is the closest they've ever coexisted. So why is this primal aggressive trait suddenly resurfacing in the heart of a major city? My initial thought was that Alpha Pokemon were a side effect of the Rogue Omega phenomenon. After all, the Rogue Omegas that you fight are significantly larger than normal, as well as being characterized as aggressive and dangerous. And since not every Pokemon is capable of Mega Evolution, maybe Alphas represent a middle ground, where a Pokemon is affected by Ange without fully becoming a Rogue Mega. And in Wild Zone 20, you can find a wide variety of random Alpha Pokemon right beneath Prism Tower, which to me feels like it could be an element of environmental storytelling, something that's meant to make you connect the dots between Prism Tower and the Alphas. But this explanation just leads to more questions, because if Ange is now gone, then why are the Alpha Pokemon still here at all? After Ange was dismantled, the Rogue Mega Pokemon completely disappeared, and yet Alphas are still pretty abundant. Which leads me to believe that this might not be the answer we're looking for either. Maybe there's something else that connects Arceus and ZA. Well, if you count the Mega Dimension DLC, I guess both games also have strange dimensional rifts. But that was also what the entire plot of Sun and Moon was about, and it's not like Alola has any strange, abnormally large Pokemon hanging around. Oh. For those that don't remember, Totem Pokemon were a type of boss fight that you could encounter during your journey in Alola, which were physically larger than normal Pokemon, and would boost their own stats at the start of the fight to become stronger. This is similar to the boost that Ultra Beasts get, and if you talk to Wick in Sun and Moon, she confirms that this is because Totem Pokemon have been exposed to the same energy, thanks to the abundance of Ultra Wormholes that have opened around Alola throughout history. And although she doesn't say it directly, it could be inferred that their increased size might also be a side effect of this energy. Before Mega Dimension came out, resident Alpha expert Miss L made me aware of the fact that the size difference between Alpha Gible and a Totem Alolan Raticate is exactly the same, since both are normally 70 cm tall and double in height to be 1.4 meters. And following the release of the DLC, we have a couple of former Totem Pokemon that can now also be Alphas. Totem Mimikyu makes the same growth as Alolan Raticate, doubling in height from 0.2 to 0.4 meters. So if this theory holds any weight, then an Alpha Mimikyu should also be the same size as the Totem. The only problem with testing this idea is that ZA doesn't give you the exact heights of individual Pokemon, so it's hard to make a direct size comparison. There's also no way of knowing if a medium-sized Mimikyu is actually the perfect average height for the species, but there is a Pokemon that we can use as a guide point. Since legendaries and mythicals obtained in ZA all have fixed sizes, that means that this Meltan should be exactly 0.2 meters tall, allowing us to use it as a standard unit of measurement. And assuming that Mimikyu is measured from the base of its body to the top of its disguise head, our Alpha Mimikyu does seem to be 2 Meltans tall, or 0.4 meters, the same height as Totem Mimikyu. While they lack the distinctive glowing red eyes of the Alpha Pokemon, the Totem Pokemon are effectively cared for by the trial captains, and Alphas do lose their red eyes when captured, which means it is possible that the Totem Pokemon are just domesticated Alphas. This dimensional energy theory also gives the justification for their presence in Lumiose during the events of ZA. While we don't know exactly how long it took to rebuild Lumiose after beating the main story, Ansha says at the start of the Mega Dimension campaign that she entered hyperspace and saw Rayquaza about 6 months ago, meaning it's very likely that while we were dealing with the Rogue Mega Crisis, Hyperspace Lumiose was brewing in the background the entire time. If Hyperspace is the source of the Lumiose Alpha Pokemon, this also explains why they didn't vanish after Ange was destroyed, because while Ange was the reason Darkrai began creating Hyperspace, this new dimension had already become self-sustaining by the time Ange was removed, meaning more Alphas continued to appear, either transforming due to the presence of unnoticed Hyperspace rifts, or maybe even escaping from within Hyperspace itself. This could also explain why so many Alphas appear in Zone 20. They aren't there because it's the source of Mega Energy, but because it's the source of Hyperspace. So if Alphas are made from dimensional energy and are not in fact a latent primal instinct, then the question is no longer what are they doing in Lumiose, but what were they doing in Hisui? As far as we know, there were no hyperspace or ultraspace wormholes in Ancient Sinnoh, although it's not impossible either. After all, Darkrai is historically connected to the Sinnoh region, and on top of that, I've always thought it was suspicious that Ingo's circumstances appear identical to Annabelle's from Sun and Moon, a character last seen in the original 2D Pokemon games who then fell through a wormhole and arrived in the 3D timeline, with nothing but her name and a vague memory of her past life. But that's a different theory entirely. Even without the influence of Mega Darkrai or the Ultra Beasts, Hisui isn't short on cracks in reality. In addition to the massive rift above Mount Coronet, there are also frequent space-time distortions opening up all around the region, and as far as we know, they might be leaking all sorts of weird interdimensional energy just like the Ultra Wormholes. In fact, this should have been evident a lot sooner. As the name implies, the space-time distortions seem to be bringing Pokemon into Hisui not just from different regions, but also different time periods, with Porygon being the most undeniable example of a Pokemon that does not belong in this era, as evidenced by Laventon's observations. And yet, Porygon that you find in these distortions can also be alphas. Somehow I never stopped to consider the implications before, but this alone is enough to disprove the initial assumption about alphas being a natural occurrence in the past. These distortions are pulling Pokemon into Hisui from all sorts of places and times, and it's entirely possible that some of them weren't alphas to begin with. And if you think this theory is getting a bit too far-fetched, don't forget that this exact idea was already established in the previous game before Legends Arceus. The entire plot of Sword and Shield is about interdimensional energy causing Pokemon to get large and become aggressive, via the Dynamax energy that originates from Eternatus. So let's recap. Alpha Pokemon seem to resemble Totem Pokemon, which we know are the result of exposure to Ultra Space, and both Hisui and Lumiose are also full of unstable rifts that may be exposing wild Pokemon to similar energy. Seeing how Legends Arceus chose to use a Johto, a Unnovan, and an Alolan starter for their starter trio, and ZA used the remaining 2 Johto Pokemon alongside Tepig, that means we are almost certainly going to see one more Legends game featuring Snivy and the 2 remaining Alolan Pokemon. On top of that, ZA itself included several references to Alola, such as Lysander making a direct reference to Z moves in his final appearance. This might be a long shot, but I could see them doing a return to Alola for another Legends game, with the similarity between Alphas and Totem Pokemon being explored further. But hey, that's just a theory. Also, I don't know how to end this video. Like and subscribe for more Range Ramblings.
That was brilliant, Candle, for me. Very much enjoyed.